Welcome to this learning series about the citizen in the democracy by the Shalom Hartman Institute. I'm Tal Becker, and I'm going to talk today about the place of disagreement of the minority opinion in a democracy. So one of the ways to think about a democracy in a way is a kind of non-violent mechanism for regulating disagreements between groups within a society. Essentially, what a democracy says, what the system of democracy says, is that different groups with competing opinions can contest to be the majority, to shape the opinion, and each time there is the opportunity for the minority to essentially become the majority. So it's a way of not resolving the actual substance of a disagreement as much as it is a way of managing that disagreement in practice. I recently read a really interesting article in The Atlantic, which was about the end of America or something very dramatic like that. And its first sentence really struck me. It said, "Democracy depends on the consent of the loser." So not democracy depends on the consent of the governed, but democracy depends on the consent of the loser. And I think the idea it was saying was how critical it is as a feature of democracy for the side that loses to feel like it still has a chance of getting back into the game, of once again being the one that is in power. And without that feeling that you are going to be the one eventually that can come back to power, the rules of the game are in jeopardy. And I think one of the ways to think about crisis in democracy, or the crisis in democracy that many feel we face, has to do with this idea that there are groups within societies that feel like if they lose, then they're going to lose forever. There's not going to be an opportunity for them to come back into power. And so when that's the case, the rules of the game feel impossible to respect anymore. So what I'd like to talk about today is the kind of sensibility, the kind of mindset you want to cultivate within a citizen in a democracy to deal with this challenge. And it has a lot to do with our attitude towards the minority view when we are the majority. What do we do to signal to that minority group that their position as a minority doesn't mean they are powerless or powerless forever, that they are somehow irrelevant, doesn't generate that sense of anxiety that risks kind of tearing apart the fabric of the rules of the game of a democracy in a kind of basic way. And there's an amazing Mishnah in Eduyot, which in a way asks this very question. It kind of is concerned with the idea of why we bother teaching the minority view, why the Talmud, the Mishnah, why in our tradition we spend time not just saying the majority view, which is how the halacha, how Jewish law will be applied, but why we keep on mentioning the minority view. And the Mishnah is about essentially this idea of disagreement, the idea of why we maintain a disagreement. And in typical fashion in Jewish sources, there is a disagreement about why we record disagreements. And that's the text I want to study with you to see if we can get an insight as to a kind of mindset or sensibility that can help us navigate this crisis. So let's take a look at the source in Eduyot. And the source in Eduyot describes essentially these two opinions about why we mention the minority view. Let's take a look at the first one. So it begins with this text, Velama maskirim divrei hayachid bein hamerubim. And I'll read it out in English. Why do they record the opinion of a single person among the many, when the halacha must be according to the opinion of the many? So that's the classic question. Why do we bother mentioning the minority view if we know we're going to follow the majority view? And the Mishnah here offers a very interesting, somewhat familiar answer for some perhaps. And it says as follows, so that if a court prefers the opinion of the single person, of the minority view, it may depend on him. That's all we need from this particular Mishnah. In a minute, we'll do the next one. But what's the Mishnah saying here? It's saying essentially the reason why we teach the minority view is because it may not always be the minority view. A later Beit Din, a later tribunal or authority can say, no, actually this time we're going to follow the minority view. And if you think about this, this is an extraordinary idea, a big idea in the Jewish tradition. And that is that the minority view has its own legitimacy. It does speak to a certain truth. And we need to preserve it and respect it, not only because it speaks to a certain truth, but because one day it might be the governing truth. It might be the path we want to follow. And so we mention it in order to legitimize it. We hold it, we keep it as part of our conversation in order to sustain it. And I think there's a really good insight here about the key difference that we have in halakha, in the idea of Jewish law, between the concept of majority and the concept of truth. The fact that a majority is in power, a majority can shape the outcome, a majority can shape what we do, is not itself testimony to some final determination about what the truth is. That minority voice is always there. It needs to be heard. And one day it needs to be kept alive because it might become the majority. And you can see in this a kind of basic idea about sustaining a society by not nullifying or delegitimizing the minority view, but teaching it to such an extent that you recognize that one day it needs to be given that space so it can come into power. So that's one view in the Mishnah, the kind of classic view, something that the Hartman Institute teaches a lot about, this idea of pluralism of ideas. But let's take a look at the second source, the second Mishnah, which disagrees with this. Said Rabbi Yehuda, he has a different answer. If this is the case, why is mention made of the opinion of an individual in connection with that of the majority? Why do we teach the minority view, excuse me, even if we know that we follow the majority? And his answer is to nullify it, in order that if one were to say he has a different tradition, he could be answered that that tradition is in accordance with the opinion of that certain individual. What Rabbi Yehuda is saying here is that the reason why we teach the minority view is to essentially say we have considered an alternative approach and we reject it. So we teach it not in order to legitimize it and sustain it, but to nullify it so that no future Beit Din, no future body can come and say, you know what, let's follow that tradition. In fact, what we say is we've already considered it and we reject it. So Rabbi Yehuda has a completely different kind of outlook. When you are the majority, you dictate the agenda, so much so that your opinion nullifies the minority view. And the only reason we teach the minority view is to make sure that people know that we've considered it and rejected it. Now, this is the brilliance or the trick of this Mishnah that I want to focus on, and we need to put our thinking caps on for this part of the discussion. What's incredible about this Mishnah is that Rabbi Yehuda's view is the minority view. And the Mishnah's view, the first Mishnah we learned, is the majority view. Now let's understand what that means. According to Rabbi Yehuda, you teach the minority view only to nullify it. But his view is the minority view. So he's seeking to nullify, or at least the author of the Mishnah is seeking to nullify that view. And according to the first Mishnah, you teach the minority view in order to sustain it. So we teach Rabbi Yehuda's view that the minority view should be nullified in order to sustain that view. So if you see, this is a kind of self-referential circle. Rabbi Yehuda, in a way, recognizes the weakness in his own argument by his view being the minority view and therefore being nullified. And the first Mishnah recognizes the weakness in its own argument by putting Rabbi Yehuda's view as the minority view, which essentially is the view that we follow to sustain a Rabbi Yehuda view. that would nullify the minority. Let's zoom out of this Mishnah and try to capture what we can learn from this in a more basic way. So I think the simple idea, the one we mentioned first, is how critical it is within a democracy for the majority to have an obligation of, at least according to that first view in the Mishnah, of sustaining the minority view, of recognizing that there isn't an equivalence between being the majority and having some kind of monopoly on truth. And actually, there's an extra responsibility on a majority to give that legitimacy, not to nullify that minority view. But the Mishnah teaches us something else, which is really quite extraordinary. And that is this kind of idea that embedded in whatever majority view you hold is somehow your own downfall if you push it all the way through. If we pushed Rabbi Yehuda's view to the full extent that the minority view should be nullified, then his own view should be nullified. And if we push the majority view to its full extent, that the minority view might one day rule, then Rabbi Yehuda's view would be sustained. So in a way, it suggests that within a society of competing views, anyone that holds on to power too tightly is in a way sows the seeds of their subsequent defeat. And it's precisely by recognizing that your argument can't capture everything, that a society has to hold these different views, that you're able to sustain it. So I think what this says about democracy in a deeper way is that democracies can crumble when we think that we have a monopoly over the truth, and that the majority's role is to completely dictate the agenda and nullify the other side. To counter that feeling that the minority feels this anxiety that they're going to be rejected, we need to cultivate a kind of anti-zero-sum consciousness, one that very much appears in that Mishnah. And there isn't really a way in societies that are torn apart, in my view, to counter that without simply educating and becoming aware of the importance of kind of respecting and holding the minority view as part of our tradition, as part of the way you hold a society together. And so, you can think about it this way: when societies are very tribal, when a democracy is tribal, and each side, when it gets into power, thinks it needs to push its agenda in a complete way, a little bit like what you sometimes see and what we're seeing, in the US with the Supreme Court nominations over the years. What that does to the other side is feel like, well, when we get in power, we have to nullify everything the other side did. And you create this kind of oscillating zero-sum dynamic in politics, where what your job in power is to undo everything that the other side did. But that precise attempt to undo what the other side did, to nullify and delegitimize what the other side did, becomes your own downfall, because it becomes the harness, the reason why the other side feels a need to retaliate. And paradoxically, majorities are able to advance their agenda in democracies in a sustainable way when they try very hard not to win by too much. To win, yes, to shape the agenda, yes, but not to completely obliterate the opposition, to look for ways in which they respect the view they don't follow, very much in the tradition of the Mishnah in Eduyot, to ask themselves, how do we take account of a minority opinion in a way that shows we are respectful to it, we recognize it's part of our society, and we don't create in that minority the feeling that if they get back to power, what they have to do is decimate the other side. And worse, the feeling that the rules of the game are so fundamentally problematic that they can't play that game at all. And so I think as an educational project, the challenge we face is, particularly in this era of social media and everyone in their own echo bubbles with their own facts, right? It's incredible to see how much there isn't this cross-tribal communication. There isn't an ability to have a common reference point in terms of the truth and in terms of facts. One of the key ways to push back against that is to develop a consciousness, and that's a long and hard educational project, that no matter what your opinion is, the sustainability of your society requires you not to view that opinion as exhausting the entire space, and to view the power you have as an opportunity to completely defeat the other side. Because that act of defeating the other side is in a way self-defeating. It's self-defeating because they will feel a need to retaliate. And it's self-defeating because you can't hold societies together in that way, where one side feels like they are permanently the loser. And this applies, I think, across political difference. I want to end with this idea about how to think about this that I sometimes use about how a majority might try to integrate the views of a minority in order not to win by too much. And an example you could use is in a criminal trial where 3 judges, for example, are deciding whether someone is guilty. Let's say it's not the jury system, it's with 3 judges. And 2 judges determine that person is guilty. And 1 judge determines that person is not innocent, is innocent, is not guilty. When it comes to sentencing, the typical way we think of sentencing is that we treat the person as guilty as if it was a 3-0 decision, as if all 3 judges had determined he was guilty. In other words, the 2 judges who said he was guilty get to treat the reality as if it's their reality. And the 1 judge who said he was not guilty, who's in the minority, is completely nullified. But another way to do this, another way to think about it, it doesn't exist in a legal system at the moment, but I'm suggesting it as an idea, is to say there should be a difference in the sentencing if it's a 3-0 decision or a 2-1 decision. If it's a 2-1 decision, then the fact that one of the judges thought this person was not guilty needs to be taken into account in the way we implement the view of the 2 judges. So yes, he's guilty, but perhaps his sentence, the criminal sentence, will be lessened. And that's a way of thinking about this as a model. When you live in a society with majority and minority views, the majority has a right to push its agenda. But it is both wise and critical for the survival of a democracy how it pushes its agenda. Does it push its agenda by completely nullifying the other side? Or does it look for ways to integrate ideas, concepts, legitimacies of the other side in the way it moves its agenda? It doesn't try to win by too much. And that's the idea I want to leave you with today, that the citizen in a democracy, a responsible citizen in democracy, is a citizen with this sensibility. They can belong to a tribe, they can belong to a group with a set agenda, but they have a higher responsibility to sustaining the rules of the game across those tribes. And that requires a different understanding of victory, a different understanding about how you use your victory, and the way in which you respect that minority view in the spirit of that Mishnah in Eduyot, and you hold it together with you, and you have it influence the way you operate, the way you function, in ways that make both democracy sustainable, but also give your view a chance to be heard and influence things for a longer period of time. So that's the idea I wanted to share with you about a citizen in democracy from the Mishnah in Eduyot. Thank you very much.